Captain Ethan Hayes had seen a lot in his years as a soldier: alien worlds reduced to rubble, the silent screams of entire civilizations wiped off the map. But nothing had prepared him for this planet. The air was thick with the smell of burnt earth, and the remnants of a once thriving metropolis lay scattered beneath a purple sky, now cracked and scarred. The war with the Selenar Alliance had decimated every corner of the galaxy, but this planet, this was ground zero. The conflict had torn apart every living thing here except one. He had been searching the ruins for weeks, hoping to find some remnants of the alien technology humanity could reverse engineer to turn the tide of the war back home. So far, all he had found were empty buildings, skeletal remains, and the quiet echo of a forgotten civilization. But then he saw her. Through the cracked window of an ancient structure, her silhouette appeared, a figure moving gracefully amid the wreckage, untouched by time or the disaster that had fallen on the planet. At first, Ethan thought it was just a mirage, a trick of his weary mind after weeks in isolation. But as he approached, the figure grew clearer. She was alien, of course, tall with skin that shimmered like liquid silver, long jet-black hair cascading down her back in intricate braids. Her eyes, large and luminous, glowed with an ethereal light that caught Ethan off guard. She was beautiful, yes, but there was more to her than that. There was an aura of loss that surrounded her, a quiet sadness that seemed to ripple through the air. Ethan's military training kicked in. He didn't approach immediately. He crouched low, using the terrain for cover. It was instinct, the survival tactics drilled into him, even when facing something like her. Was she a survivor of the Selenar Alliance? A trap? A scout for a larger force waiting to ambush him? But when she turned and met his gaze, something in her expression stopped him. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't even wary. In fact, she seemed almost relieved to see him. The tension that had coiled in Ethan's gut loosened slightly as he stood, stepping out from behind the rubble. Slowly, carefully, he advanced toward her, hands raised in a universal gesture of peace. The woman, no alien, did not flinch. Instead, she straightened and took a tentative step toward him. As she did, Ethan could see her more clearly. The ragged edges of her once grand armor, the faint, almost imperceptible tear stains on her cheeks. She was alone, and she was desperate. She spoke in a language he didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, as if she was asking for something more than just survival. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he tried to comprehend the moment. His mission had always been about the war, about finding resources and returning to Earth. But now, standing before this woman, this widow, he realized that his purpose had just changed. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he took another cautious step toward the alien woman. Her eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light of the ruined city, never left his face. He could tell she wasn't frightened. If anything, she seemed almost relieved. Still, he had to be careful. His mission was to gather intel, not to get entangled in the plight of one lone survivor. She spoke again, her voice low and melodic, yet the words were alien, incomprehensible to him. Ethan stood still, unsure of what to do. He couldn't risk being caught off guard. He reached for his translator device, but she shook her head gently, her fingers moving in the air in a series of graceful gestures. It was as if she was trying to communicate something deeper, something beyond words. For a long moment, they both stood there in silence, surrounded by the remnants of a war that had torn both their worlds apart. Ethan studied her carefully. She didn't seem like a threat, not with the way she carried herself, like someone who had known great loss, who had fought for her life, but now seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself, unsure of why he felt the need to speak. It wasn't as though she could understand him either. To his surprise, she tilted her head, as if contemplating his words. Then, in a smooth, deliberate motion, she knelt before him. Her eyes, filled with both sorrow and hope, locked with his. She reached into a pouch on her side and pulled out a small, intricately carved stone, a relic from her people, something from her past. She placed it in his hand, the smooth surface warm against his skin. Ethan stared at the stone, confusion mounting. What was she trying to say? Without warning, she stood up again, her movements graceful but burdened, as though every step was a struggle. She pointed toward the horizon, where the last remnants of sunlight flickered across the jagged remains of an ancient structure. Then she turned back to him and spoke once more, this time, her voice tinged with urgency. Ethan instinctively took a step forward, but she held up a hand, her face now serious, even fierce. The sadness in her eyes deepened, and she motioned again to the horizon, then pressed her hand to her chest as though asking for something. Her gesture was unmistakable, and the weight of it settled heavily in his chest. She wanted his help. She needed it. "Why me?" Ethan asked, more to himself than to her. "What do you want from me?" Her gaze softened, and she knelt once more, this time laying her hands gently on his forearms. The stone she had given him pulsed with a strange energy, and as she looked up into his eyes, he saw something else there, something like a prayer, a plea. Her eyes were filled with hope. And in that moment, something deep within Ethan shifted. He didn't know why, but he couldn't turn away. "I'll help," he said, though he still didn't understand. But somehow, he knew his life had just changed forever. Over the next few days, Ethan traveled with Lyra deeper into the planet's ruins. She led the way with an unspoken urgency, her movements purposeful despite her apparent exhaustion. Ethan's military instincts kicked in, scanning their surroundings, aware of the dangers that might lurk in the shadow of this broken world. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the wind's mournful howls through the decaying skeletons of the once great structures. Despite his heightened alertness, Ethan couldn't shake the strange pull Lyra had on him. Every time their eyes met, something flickered between them. An understanding, though unspoken, that he couldn't quite explain. She had given him no name, only gestures and glances, but there was an undeniable connection that seemed to grow with every step they took together. As they walked, Lyra began to communicate more through her actions than words. She showed him how to navigate the labyrinth of destroyed cities, leading him to places he never would have thought to search. Her knowledge of this alien world was astonishing. In the aftermath of the war, the cities had become little more than forgotten graves, overgrown with strange, alien flora and littered with relics of a civilization lost to time. Yet with Lyra as his guide, they uncovered things Ethan never expected. A library half buried in sand, a dormant shuttle buried in the side of a canyon, ancient technology that hummed faintly beneath the soil. One evening, as they camped by the remnants of an old temple, Lyra finally spoke. Her voice was soft, a lilting cadence that filled the quiet air between them. Her words were still foreign, but Ethan had grown accustomed to their rhythm. He had started to pick out patterns in her speech, and though he couldn't understand everything, he knew she was telling him a story. Lyra pointed to a faded mural on the wall of the temple, depicting humans and her people. Tall, graceful beings with luminous eyes, engaged in an ancient ritual. They were standing side by side, their hands linked in unity. Ethan stared at the painting, struck by the bond it depicted between their species. The Xelnar people and humans had never been allies, not in the way the mural suggested. They had been enemies for centuries, clashing over territory, resources, and ideologies. But the mural painted a different picture, one of cooperation, of shared goals. Lyra's gaze remained fixed on him, her expression intense, pleading. She gestured to the mural, then to herself, then back to him. Ethan's stomach tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. "You're saying, we were once allies?" he asked, his voice rough. Lyra nodded, her eyes full of something that felt like hope, but hope tinged with the deep sorrow of a loss too great to express. She moved closer, placing her hand on the wall, as if trying to pull the story from the past into the present. Her eyes were pleading again, not just for survival, but for something more. a future, a rebirth. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. She wanted him to believe in that future. She wanted him to help her rebuild what had been destroyed. But why him? Lyra reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small ornate pendant, a piece of jewelry he hadn't seen before. She handed it to him, pressing it into his palm, and he realized that it wasn't just a trinket. It was a symbol, something important. "You want me to lead them," Ethan whispered, understanding finally dawning on him. Lyra's gaze never wavered, and she nodded slowly. The silence between them was heavy, but it was no longer awkward. The weight of her plea, of her people's need, pressed down on Ethan like the gravity of a new responsibility he hadn't expected. He didn't know what to say, or if he was even capable of fulfilling her request. But the look in her eyes, the trust, the desperation, the hope, was enough to tell him that his journey had only just begun. The days blurred into one another as Ethan and Lyra moved deeper into the ruined cities, their travels now marked by a strange rhythm. Ethan had become accustomed to Lyra's presence, her quiet grace as she led them through the remnants of her world. The alien world, once vibrant and full of life, now felt more like a graveyard, a place where the past lingered like a shadow, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet every step they took together seemed to bring a glimmer of life back to the decaying planet, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of something bigger than just a mission. Lyra's urgency had grown since they uncovered the ancient murals. Every place they visited seemed to hold more significance, more meaning to her than to him. She would trace the walls of old buildings, run her fingers along alien scripts that she could no longer read, and occasionally pause, her expression distant, as though trying to pull something from the past that no longer existed. She rarely spoke, but Ethan could tell that the weight of her memories was overwhelming. One morning, as the sun rose over the wreckage of a collapsed pyramid, Lyra motioned for Ethan to follow her. She had found something, a hidden chamber beneath the rubble, sealed tight for millennia. With a few precise movements, she cleared the debris, revealing a doorway that led into the earth. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped inside. The air was cool, and the faint hum of technology reverberated through the stone. The room was a vault of sorts, filled with artifacts, some still glowing with faint energy. But it wasn't the technology that caught Ethan's eye, it was the paintings on the walls. They were similar to the mural they had seen before, depicting scenes of cooperation, of humans and Selenar working together, constructing something monumental. But in this chamber, the tone was different. It was darker, filled with moments of struggle, and then, an image that struck Ethan to his core, a human warrior standing beside a Selenar queen, their hands intertwined, facing a great cosmic enemy. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the image. She didn't need to say anything. Ethan could feel it. This was the prophecy she had spoken of. The warrior, the queen. It wasn't just a legend, it was a history that had been hidden, lost in the aftermath of war. "The prophecy," Ethan whispered, his voice reverberating in the silence. "It's real." Lyra nodded slowly, her face set in determination. She took his hand, pressing it to the mural, as if trying to impart the weight of the past into him. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she spoke clearly, though the words were still foreign to him. "Help me," she said, the word simple but charged with meaning. "Help us." Ethan swallowed hard. He had come here to scout, to gather intel, but now he was caught in the threads of something far larger than any military mission. This wasn't just about technology or survival. This was about hope, a hope she had placed in him, a hope that seemed impossible, but in that moment felt real. "I'll help," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. Lyra's face softened, and for a fleeting moment, a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It was small, but it held the weight of centuries of longing. As they stood in the ancient chamber, surrounded by the remnants of a civilization, Ethan realized that his decision had already been made. There was no going back now. The weight of Lyra's plea lingered in Ethan's mind as they continued their journey through the ruins. The images of the murals and the hidden chamber from the day before had ignited something inside him, a sense of responsibility that was impossible to ignore. He had gone from a soldier with a mission to someone caught up in a destiny that didn't belong to him. The question now was, what would he do with it? Lyra's determination had only grown since they uncovered the prophecy, and as the days passed, Ethan began to see that she wasn't just asking him for help. She was asking him to become something more. To her, the prophecy was more than an ancient myth. It was a lifeline. The hope of her people's rebirth was tied to him, whether he was ready for it or not. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a future. Lyra had shared her story in fragmented pieces, but he understood now that she wasn't just a survivor of the war. She was a leader, someone who had once been at the heart of a thriving civilization. Her people had flourished alongside humanity long before the war began. And now, she was the last of them, the last of a dying world. She needed him to help lead her people to something better. One evening, as the shadows stretched long across the ruins, Lyra stopped in front of an old stone altar. It was covered in moss, but the carvings on it were still sharp, still telling the story of an ancient ceremony. Lyra touched the stones gently, her fingertips tracing the familiar symbols with reverence. Ethan could feel the weight of her gaze on him, and when she turned to face him, the sorrow in her eyes was impossible to ignore. She was tired, weary in ways he couldn't fully comprehend, and yet there was a fire in her that refused to die. "Tell me," Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. "What do you need from me? You're asking me to lead your people, but I don't know how to do that. I'm not a king. I'm a soldier. I've fought wars, not built civilizations." Lyra didn't answer immediately. She stood there for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the stars were beginning to twinkle through the darkened sky. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, but her words cutting through the air like a blade. "The prophecy speaks of a warrior, yes," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "But it does not speak of a king. It speaks of a guide, a protector, someone who will help us rebuild, help us find peace again. You are not here to rule, Ethan Hayes. You are here to help us rise from the ashes of our past." Her word hung heavy between them, and Ethan felt a deep tug at his chest. She was right. He wasn't here to take control. He wasn't here to lead them with an iron fist, but he was here to help them, to be part of something that could heal the wounds of this broken world. Lyra's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, reaching out to place her hand on his. The contact was warm, reassuring, and as her fingers closed around his, he felt an undeniable connection between them. It wasn't just about the prophecy. It was about what they could build together, something new. "We can't do it alone," she said softly. "I can't do it alone." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her trust settle on his shoulders. The path ahead wasn't clear, and he didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave her to face this battle on her own. "I won't abandon you," he said, his voice firm. It wasn't much, but it was a promise that, in that moment, felt like it could change everything. The days turned into weeks as Ethan and Lyra pressed on, moving through the devastated cities and over the harsh terrain, each step taking them closer to an uncertain future. Lyra's strength seemed unshakable, and Ethan found himself relying more and more on her guidance, her wisdom, and the unspoken bond they shared. They had started to uncover more of the hidden remnants of Selenar culture, temples, archives, and pieces of technology that hummed with a life of their own. But the deeper they went, the more Ethan realized how fragile their existence was. This was no longer just about exploration. It was a race against time. One evening, as they camped by a creek that cut through the ruins of an old marketplace, Lyra seemed distant. She sat alone on a rock, her legs drawn up to her chest, staring out at the water with a faraway look in her eyes. Ethan had come to recognize the signs. the quiet moments when the past seemed to rise up and overwhelm her. He knew better than to push her, but he also knew that she needed to talk. He approached slowly, taking a seat beside her. The water flowed lazily past them, its soft gurgling a calming contrast to the tension that had been building in the air for days. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low. "I can see it in your eyes. What's wrong?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. She let out a long, weary sigh, her fingers trailing idly in the water. Ethan waited, giving her the time she needed. Finally, she spoke. "It's been so long since I've seen any of my people, since I've seen any sign of life. I had hoped that there would be something left, that someone would be out there waiting for me, waiting for us. But the truth is, we're alone, Ethan. My people are gone. And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that there's hope." Her voice cracked on the last words, and Ethan felt the sting of her sorrow in his chest. He could see the weight of her grief, the years of isolation, the unbearable loss of everything she had ever known. Ethan reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering the comfort he wasn't sure he could provide. "You're not alone, Lyra. Not anymore. I'm here. I'll help you rebuild. We'll find a way." She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no hint of doubt in her gaze. "You don't know what that means to me," she whispered. He wanted to say something more, something that would make all of this easier, but the words didn't come. All he could do was sit beside her, offering his presence as a silent promise. They both knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but for the first time in a long while, Lyra allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. The quiet moments stretched between them, and in that space, it felt like they weren't just two survivors of a broken world. They were something more, two souls bound together by a shared mission, a shared dream. And that was enough, at least for now. As the night fell, the stars slowly emerged, twinkling softly above them. Lyra stood, her resolve returning. She looked to Ethan, her eyes steady. "Tomorrow, we go to the Citadel," she said, her voice filled with purpose. Ethan nodded, standing to meet her gaze. "Then let's go." For the first time, he could see a future ahead of them, a future they could shape together. The journey to the Citadel was more treacherous than Ethan had anticipated. The path was winding and steep, leading them through narrow ravines and rocky hillsides. The air grew thinner as they ascended, and the landscape became more hostile. Sparse patches of alien vegetation clinging to the edges of jagged cliffs, and the remnants of ancient defenses scattered across the terrain. Ethan kept his focus sharp, his hand resting on the hilt of his rifle as they made their way through the hostile environment, knowing that danger could strike at any moment. Lyra, however, moved with an ease that both amazed and unsettled him. She seemed to know the terrain instinctively, as though the land itself whispered its secrets to her. Her determination never wavered, even when the journey became grueling. It was as though the weight of her people's future rested solely on her shoulders, and she would carry that burden no matter the cost. Ethan couldn't help but admire her strength, her unwavering commitment to something she couldn't fully define yet, a future she couldn't guarantee. After several days of travel, they reached the outskirts of the Citadel, an imposing structure carved into the side of a mountain, its ancient spires rising like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The Citadel had once been the heart of that Selenar civilization, a place of knowledge, culture, and power. Now it stood silent and abandoned, its once shining walls now dull and worn, like the rest of the world they had left behind. Lyra stopped at the foot of the Citadel's massive gates, her gaze fixed on the towering structure before her. Her expression was unreadable, but Ethan could feel the weight of her emotions. This was the place she had hoped would offer salvation, the place where she believed she could bring her people back to life. But standing before it now, it felt like a monument to all that had been lost. She turned to Ethan, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "This is where it all began," she said, her voice a mixture of reverence and sorrow. "This is where we flourished, where we built the foundation of our society. And now it's the last place where we might be able to rebuild." Ethan nodded, though a knot formed in his stomach. He wasn't sure what they would find inside. It could be more ruins, more reminders of a dead civilization, or it could be the key to everything she had been searching for. Either way, they had come this far. There was no turning back now. Lyra took a deep breath and stepped forward, placing her hand on the gate. With a low hum, the massive doors began to open, the ancient mechanisms creaking to life after centuries of disuse. The air that rushed out from the citadel was cool and tinged with the scent of decay, but it also carried something else, a faint, unmistakable energy. This was it. They stepped inside, and as the doors closed behind them, the silence of the citadel enveloped them like a shroud. Ethan had no idea what they would find within the citadel's walls, but he knew one thing for sure. Their future would be decided here. Ethan stared at the dark shape in the holographic projection, the sense of dread in his chest growing with each passing second. The weapon Lyra spoke of was more than just a tool of destruction. It was a part of the Selnar's legacy, a relic of their greatest mistake. The idea of awakening it felt like tempting fate, but there was no turning back now. If they were to have any chance of rebuilding, of saving her people, they would have to face the consequences of their ancestors' actions. Lyra's eyes never left the projection, her voice low and filled with sorrow. The weapon was meant to be a safeguard, a last resort against invaders. But in the end, it consumed us. We lost control of it. And now it waits in the heart of the citadel, dormant but deadly. It is a creation born of both brilliance and arrogance, and it will either save us or destroy us all. Ethan clenched his fists. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced in his military career. This wasn't just about surviving a battle. It was about deciding the fate of an entire species. His mind raced, trying to grasp the full scope of what they were up against. Could they control the weapon? Could Lyra? Could he bring it to life without unleashing its destructive potential? Turning back to Lyra, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm with you." His voice was steady, but beneath it was the weight of uncertainty. They didn't have the luxury of time to second-guess their actions. "But we need a plan." Lyra nodded, her jaw set in determination. "We need to access the core of the citadel. The weapon is connected to a system deep beneath the surface. I thought I could do it on my own, but I was wrong. It requires 2 people to awaken it, and one of them has to be you, Ethan." The prophecy. It was always meant to be a partnership. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the full weight of her words sank in. He was no longer just a soldier. He was part of something far greater, something that could change the course of history. He glanced back at the holographic image, at the looming shape of the weapon, and then back to Lyra, whose eyes now glowed with a fierce resolve. "Let's do it," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Together." Lyra stepped forward, guiding him to the far side of the room, where a hidden panel opened at her touch. Beneath it, a set of glowing symbols appeared, and the floor shifted slightly, revealing a staircase descending into the heart of the citadel. The air was thick with anticipation, and as they descended, Ethan felt the gravity of the moment settling on his shoulders. They reached the core chamber, a massive underground vault filled with dormant energy. At the center of the room lay the weapon, its form eerily quiet, its power waiting to be awakened. Ethan could feel the pulsing energy in the air, and his breath caught in his throat. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked, her hand finding his once again, their fingers intertwined. Ethan nodded. There was no turning back. They had come too far, and whatever came next, they would face it together. With a final, synchronized motion, they activated the device, and the weapon hummed to life. The citadel trembled, and for a brief moment, Ethan wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But as the weapon's power surged, he realized that this was their only hope. The future of Lyra's people, and perhaps his own, now rested in their hands. The light from the weapon filled the chamber, and as it did, Ethan and Lyra stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next, together.